All right, so if you've ever gotten into pulse diagnosis, you know that some of the descriptions, they can be a bit, let's say, poetic. And that makes them almost impossible to really get a feel for. So today, we're going to cut right through the mystery of two of the trickiest ones out there, the soggy and the fine pulses. And we're going to do it with a metaphor that's so simple, you probably have it in your kitchen right now.
So here it is, right? The classic description, like silk in water. I mean, it sounds beautiful, doesn't it? But as lovely as that sounds, it's not super helpful in a practical sense. What does that actually feel like when you put your fingers on someone's wrist?
Exactly. That's the real question. You know, it's one thing to read a phrase like silk in water in a textbook, but it's a completely different challenge to confidently say, yep, that's what I'm feeling, on a real person. We need something we can actually grab onto, something more tangible. And this is really the heart of the puzzle. The words themselves, like soft or mushy or weak, they're kind of slippery, aren't they? You could use them to describe a few different pulse qualities, and that just leads to a whole lot of confusion. So how do you tell them apart? That's the big question. If you press down and all you're getting is this vague sense of softness, how can you possibly know for sure if it's a soggy pulse or maybe a weak pulse or something else entirely? We've got to find a clearer way to differentiate.
Okay, so here's the solution. I've got a really simple everyday analogy that I think is going to make this whole thing just click for you.
Yep, we're going to talk about noodles. Seriously, the key to finally getting a handle on these super subtle pulse feelings is something that most of us are really familiar with. A simple bowl of noodles. Now, to really understand the soggy pulse, it's super helpful to put it right up against its opposite, which is the fine pulse. It really just boils down to one simple idea. The soggy pulse is all about excess. There's too much of something, in this case, moisture or what we call dampness. The fine pulse, though, is the total opposite. It's about deficiency. There's just not enough blood or yin to actually fill up the vessel. Okay, so keep that idea in your head. Excess versus deficiency. And let's get a mental picture going. I want you to imagine two completely different bowls of noodles, because this is where the actual feeling of the pulse is going to come alive for you. First, let's talk about the soggy noodle or rumai. Just imagine a noodle that's been left sitting in broth for way too long. You know what I'm talking about. It gets all bloated, it's mushy, it's completely waterlogged. That feeling is our perfect metaphor for the soggy pulse. It has that exact same over-soaked, mushy quality. Okay, now let's think about the fine noodle, or simai. This time, I want you to picture a noodle that's been left out on the counter and is totally dried out. It's lost all its moisture, right? So it's become thin, kind of delicate, almost wiry. And that's our perfect image for the fine pulse. All right, so now we have the feeling down. We've got our soggy noodle and our fine dry noodle. The next step is to connect that feeling to what's actually causing it. Why do these different textures even show up in the pulse to begin with? So let's break this down. For a soggy pulse, the problem is that there's excess dampness, but the reason for that dampness is usually a deficiency of qi or yang. Think of qi and yang as the energy that's supposed to move fluids around. When that energy is weak, the fluid just sits there. It stagnates, and that's what gives you that waterlogged, soggy noodle feeling. On the flip side, the fine pulse is much more straightforward. It's just a deficiency of blood or yin. There's simply not enough substance, not enough fluid to fill up the blood vessel, and that's why it feels so thin. Okay, you with me? Now that we've got this noodle metaphor really locked in our minds, let's circle back to those beautiful, poetic descriptions from the beginning. I promise they're about to make a whole lot more sense. Remember this one? Like silk in water? For the soggy pulse. It probably seemed pretty abstract before, right? But let's look at it again now, thinking about our soggy noodle. This is the key. The pulse feels weak, sure, but the important thing is that it also feels full. It's full of excess fluid. So even though it has no strength, no real pushback under your finger, it has volume. It feels mushy and bloated, just like that silk soaking up water, or our soggy noodle. It's weak, but it's also swollen. All right, now let's apply the same logic to the fine pulse. The classic description you always hear is that it's fine and straight, like a thread. And now that makes perfect sense, doesn't it? The reason it feels like a thread is because there isn't enough blood or fluid to plump up the vessel. It feels thin, it feels depleted. It really is like you're trying to feel a single, delicate thread under your fingertip. It's weak precisely because it's lacking substance, just like that fine, dry noodle. So let's just boil it down to its simplest form. Soggy pulse, that's the rumai, is about an excess of yin or dampness. It feels like a soggy noodle. The fine pulse, the simai, is about a deficiency of blood or yin. It feels like a fine, dry noodle. It's really that simple. Excess versus deficiency. But wait, there's a little more to it. These conditions, they don't just exist in a vacuum, right? A soggy pulse or a fine pulse is often just a snapshot in time. As the underlying condition gets worse or changes, the pulse can actually evolve into other related sensations. So let's start with the soggy pulse. It's caused by excess dampness. But if that dampness hangs around for a while, it can start to congeal and get thicker, turning into what we call phlegm. And when that happens, the pulse quality can actually shift from just being soggy to becoming a slippery pulse. And it works the same way on the other side of the spectrum. A fine pulse tells us there's a lack of yin or blood. Well, what happens if that deficiency gets even worse? The pulse can become even more delicate, even more fragile, and it can progress from being fine to becoming a faint pulse. So what's the difference in feeling? Well, a slippery pulse is also kind of swollen and full, but it feels smooth, almost like little beads rolling under your finger. It's got a definite sliding quality. And a faint pulse? It takes the thinness of the fine pulse to a whole new level. It feels extremely thin and weak, almost like it could just break off or disappear at any second. You see, a pulse isn't just a beat. It's a whole story. And by starting with something as simple as a noodle, we can start to figure out how to read these really subtle messages about what's going on inside. So the real question is, what story is your body telling? Once you know what to feel for, that difference between a soggy, waterlogged noodle and a fine, dry one, you've taken a huge first step toward being able to read that story.